All right, folks, thanks for joining us today. I know people will be streaming in, but typically the first few minutes we kind of go over some Agile Austin stuff. So wanted to welcome everybody to today's Agile at Scale SIG, March 17th, 2023. Agile Austin's mission is to connect people, foster professional growth. We're really about communication. Last month, we actually did one of our first hybrid SIG since the pandemic started. This one is just all virtual, but we'll be having more hybrid ones in the future. We love to promote communication within the Austin community, but the pandemic has kind of afforded us the capability to work with people all over the globe. So it's been kind of a benefit in that way, if you want to look at the bright side of things. Our 2022-2023 board members, Max Casey, there's our president, Steve Martin, myself, Scott Killen, who's the founder of Agile Austin, is our treasurer now, and Angela, our chief product officer. We're all available to chat if you have anything that you want to go over. You can see we're all in the contact email that you'll see later, but also the board at agileaustin.org if you have any thoughts, opinions, or want to help us or contribute. We, of course, have our sponsors we love to thank, Retrospectives, and our silver sponsors, Ad Meloria, WellSky, the 321 Gang. They were all prominently featured at our conference last year, hoping to have another conference this coming year as well. So just thanks to them for making this and those things possible. So if you're interested in becoming a sponsor, contact agileaustin.org, and membership, our website, agileaustin.org, benefits like conference recordings and discounts for the book club, and various other things as well. We also have other special interest groups, our Agile Coaching, Agile at Scale, this one, Lean Kanban. We've got a lot of stuff going on. Hope to get a product SIG started back up here soon as well. So these are ever evolving. I ran a QA SIG for quite a while. So if you're interested in running one, again, contact at agileaustin.org. We'd love to have you in our lineup. And volunteering as well, that same email address. We have a social media committee. We have various different places that we can use help. So if you've got time on your hands, we would love to have you. And I also wanted to say later on this month, we're celebrating Women's History Month with an event of some amazing women leaders in Agile and Tech. I'll post the link in the chat if you want to sign up. Love to have you on that as well. It'll be a virtual event too over soon. And just real quick about us, Leland's been running this thing since 2016. I joined him in 2020. And so we love all things Agile, and looking forward to hearing more about that in today's presentation. Just real quick, upcoming, we have Eric Lassard talking to us about SAFe and Kanban teams. And then we'll also do, sorry, that was a copy and paste error, but we're going to do a deeper dive on SAFe version 6.0 in May 2023. The April one is posted on Meetup. The May one will post once we have the speaker locked down for that. Might be Leland, or it could be someone else. And so then today's presentation will be OKRs and Agile sitting on a tree, and Yuval will be walking us through that topic. You can see his bio here. A ton of great experience, and look forward to this presentation today. So wanted to thank you all for coming, and you can reach out to us directly, either Leland or myself, at agileaustin.org, and we'll help get you sorted. So with that, I am going to stop sharing my screen, and I will let Yuval take over. And thanks again to everyone for joining.
Thank you, Ben. Stop. All right. The sharing working fine for everybody? Good. Some thumbs up. So let's dive right in. OKRs and Agile sitting on a tree. That's a topic that kind of comes up based on the work that I'm doing with organizations these days. My background is as an Agile coach, experience with SAFe, being a fellow and Scrum.org trainer, and helped create Scrum with Kanban. And over the last couple of years, more and more of the work that I'm doing with organizations, like the ones that you see at the top there, has brought Agile in contact with the topic of OKRs, objectives and key results. And while there's some potential friction and conflict between these concepts in the trenches, there's actually the potential for a lot of synergy, and that synergy is what I'm going to try to talk about today. So what are we going to talk about today? Let's maybe use an OKR to describe that. So an OKR is an objective, an outcome that you want to achieve. So for example, our objective for today could be learn how to effectively use OKRs by leveraging Scrum and Agile concepts. Key results are some concrete results that we'll look for that are things to measure, to tell us whether we're on track or have we achieved our outcome, our objective. So key results could be, let's have a high-level understanding of OKRs. Why do we use them? What are them? What are they? How to use them effectively? Be able to describe a couple of implementation challenges you might encounter with OKRs. Maybe you are encountering them in your organizations. Let's maybe describe some success patterns of how to overcome these challenges, leveraging Agile and Scrum principles and practices. That's where we'll start to see the synergy rather than friction. And maybe we'll get to talk a bit about how to use Agile and Scrum practices to improve any sort of OKR implementation, even if it's outside the Agile and Scrum context in other areas of the organization. And hopefully you'll be able to talk to people in your organization or your clients about how Agile and Scrum principles and practices can fit into an OKR story. Feel free to add questions in the chat along the way. I'll pause to monitor them from time to time, and we'll have time for Q&A towards the end. So let's start with an overview of OKRs. The key thinking behind objectives and key results is that in order to execute effectively on what matters most, in other terms, your strategy, you'll need to do some things. You'll need to overcome the fact that as your organization grows, there are silos, there are politics, there are turf wars. Lancioni wrote about this pattern in his book called Silos, Politics, and Turf Wars. You'll also need to overcome the fact that there's an ongoing grind. 4DX calls this the whirlwind. The ongoing work that keeps coming, that makes it hard to focus on what's strategic for us. So OKRs are intended to provide both organizational alignment across the different functions on what's most important to us and help us focus on these things. They were brought to life by Andy Grove in Intel as a way to align and focus the organization. John Doerr, as an investor, took those ideas and started to spread them throughout the VC and startup ecosystem in the Silicon Valley. And from there, it grew on and on to the point that today, if you're either a scaling startup or a company that private equity invested in, most likely at some point you'll be handed the book Measure What Matters by one of your investors or board members or operating partners, and they'll tell you, read this up and look at how to implement OKRs. We want to see what your OKRs look like. So that's like common language in that space, and that's why a lot of organizations are starting to use these techniques. They come from, the leadership level, typically, and eventually when they start to percolate through the organization, they meet us and our agile processes and agile backlogs. And, there are some questions that come up around how do these two operating systems for managing work and managing priorities coexist. By the way, Measure What Matters is the most popular book in the OKR space, but not necessarily the best book. I actually recommend Radical Focus by Christina Wutke that provides a more nuanced, practical version of how to implement OKRs, and also in a way that's a bit more aligned with the world of agility. So I see that Tom already provided a comment here, eliminate management by objectives. I'll get to MBO later here. It is true that OKRs are an evolution of management by objectives. OKRs are intended to address some of the shortcomings of MBO. We'll get to that. So OKRs stand for Objectives and Key Results, a collaborative goal-setting methodology used by teams and individuals to set challenging, ambitious goals with measurable results. There are how you track progress, create alignment, and encourage engagement around measurable goals. So far, so good. Why do we even need an alignment framework? Here, I really like Stephen Bungai's perspective about 3 frictions or 3 gaps. Basically, what Bungai talks about is that if you want to achieve outcomes, there are a couple of things that would be in your way to actually achieve the outcomes that you want. One is what we call the knowledge gap, the difference between what we would like to know and what we actually know. So we make plans with limited knowledge, essentially. Then there's the gap between the plans and the actions. That's the alignment gap, the difference between what we want people to do and what they actually do. And then there's the effect gap, which is basically that we expect some actions to achieve an impact and the actual outcome might be different. If you're an agilist, you're probably thinking, well, what's described here is a complex world. A world with, Stephen Bungay talked about the art of action, this applied to warfare. The Prussians discovered that war is a complex thing and they need operating systems and ways of, fighting that acknowledge that. And that's true. That's essentially what Bungay talks about. The point that he's making that should also be part of OKRs is we need an alignment framework because we cannot tell everybody in the organization what to do and expect that to be successful because we don't know what's the thing to do, because it's hard to get across exactly what we mean. And, even if we have a plan of what to do, the effects might not be the effects that we want them to be. So there's uncertainty both about the what and the how and the communication around that. And alignment framework is kind of similar to what we do with user stories, if we're honest about it. What's the concept of a user story? We focus on the why and the what. We don't go into the how. We leave room for the people in the trenches, the agile team, to figure out the how and inspect and adapt with different increments until they achieve the goal. That's the intent of OKRs at the higher level of the organization, where we don't necessarily use an agile mechanism, but it's similar intents. If you put on your agile lenses, you could start to see what OKRs are trying to achieve. So nice intent, but there are a lot of problems when people implement this. One problem is that when the organization reads or learns about OKRs, they then turn everything into an OKR. Couple of problems here. One is people work on too many things. You've probably seen, Lucy in the chocolate factory and what happens when, Lucy and Ethel try to work on too many chocolate balls at the same time without sustainable pace. So we want to make sure that we manage the flow of OKRs in the organization, apply stop starting, start finishing to OKRs as well, and focus on the couple of key things that are really important to us, because if everything is important, nothing is important. So that's one very common issue. The other thing that we're seeing is that everything becomes an OKR. And that's not what OKRs are designed for. OKRs are designed to focus on developing, growing the business, not running the business. Not everything that you do to run the day-to-day needs to be an OKR. That's what KPIs are for. So key performance indicators or key promise indicators, that's another interesting language around it. Those can be used to make sure that we're running the business effectively. If you're familiar with SAFe and value streams, that's what we talk about. That's what the operational value stream is about, where we run our key business processes. Those things don't need to be an OKR. OKRs are for things that develop our strategic differentiators or improve things, significant things in our operational value stream. So in a sense, OKRs are for what we call the development value stream, things that we do to develop our business. So let's focus on what do we really want to develop or grow in our business. And let's apply focus and flow, stop starting, start finishing to OKRs as well. And those two actions would basically reduce very quickly the number of OKRs that we have. KPIs are not OKRs, okay? We reduce the amount, and then let's think about how many OKRs can we really run in our organization or our business unit. Maybe even start to manage an OKRs Kanban to give visibility to that, to help manage the flow. So one interesting conclusion here that goes back to my point about complexity earlier is if we look at the difference between running the business and developing and growing the business, in many worlds, growing the business is complex, while running the business or operating the business can be work that's a bit more simple or complicated. So for example, if you think about manufacturing a car, or let's take an actual recent client. So Gillette, when they're designing a new razor, that's complex work. They're trying to figure out, what are we really looking for? Why aren't we, shaving every day? What would make it more attractive for us to do that? How to make it easier for us? What would sell well? What would we appreciate? What would we notice? Converging towards a design that makes sense is complex, but manufacturing it and running the logistics of selling it, unless you're trying to do that during a pandemic, that's more towards the simple. If you look at hospitals, for example, running the operational value stream, treating patients, most of that work is not complex. Let's put House aside, Dr. House aside. When you need Dr. House's help, that's complex, right? He's running a lot of increments. But when you try to improve the operational value stream and figure out, should we do this, should we do that, combine clinics, help the organization think more holistically, make a change towards electronic medical records, EMR, that's more complex, and that would be in the development value stream and would be the domain where OKRs are applicable. So interesting connection between OKRs, KPIs, complex, simple. And if we agree that OKRs typically require complex work, what's the conclusion about how to execute on OKRs or how to design OKRs? There are some interesting conclusions there that we can start to think about. You might see already where I'm going with this. So the other big issue is that we see a lot of output and activity focused OKRs, a lot of tasks, a lot of milestones, similar to, the Agile teams that have tasks as their stories in their backlogs rather than outcomes. Why does it matter? We just talked about the fact that OKRs live in the complex domain where it's the wrong move to fix specifications and designs too early in the cycle. We want to leave room for learning what's working and inspect and adapt. It drives, the behavior of a fixture factory or taking orders and, just doing stuff micromanaged from the top, and can be an impediment to autonomy and innovation. You might find, OKRs that look like this. We have an objective to do a release, and the key results would be very concrete descriptions of what we want to achieve. That doesn't leave a lot of room for maneuvering around, what we learn and achieving outcomes. It's creating teams that become order takers and requirement implementers rather than empowered product teams or empowered teams that focus on outcomes. So what should we do about it? The first thing to do is pay attention to this. At least have some awareness of what kind of OKR is this one. Mark OKRs as output-focused OKRs, or OKRs that are outcome-focused or well-formed outcome-focused OKRs. Gain some insight into the maturity of the different OKRs in the organization, and maybe over time measure that. Measure, okay, of the OKRs that we have, what's the average maturity level? Where do they stand on output versus outcome? And this might help you, manage the improvement of the maturity of your OKRs, the shift towards outcome focus. Remember, the principles that can help you here are, we want to assume variability in a complex environment, so we want to preserve optionality. If we talk about outputs, there's no optionality. If we talk about outcomes, there's room to maneuver. User stories, again, that's what we try to do there. We want to decentralize control and empower teams to figure out what's the right solution, and we want to maintain the ability to collaborate with our customers rather than negotiate contracts. So over time, what we want to see is a transition from these sort of OKRs that are output focused to outcomes, like increase the market position within the autonomous delivery market. That's a better OKR. The key results are now more outcome oriented as well. Let's talk about the ability to deliver in dense metro areas through parallel parking or improve our customer satisfaction rating. And eventually we'll get to well-formed OKRs, where you see one of the major differences here is that this becomes more quantitative. The key results become more quantitative. And even the objective becomes more quantitative. Dominant position is more specific, quantitative than increased market position. Let me pause here and see what question came up. When we've used OKRs, we found them OKR and is MVP. Objectives and key MVP results. We make them train the results. I mean, for me, if I read that statement, I definitely could see an MVP being a way, an MVP to be a specific key result that helps us learn on are we in the right direction. I wouldn't go and be prescriptive as to say we always have MVPs as part of the key result. Sometimes we need an MVP. Sometimes an MVP is is redundant if we have enough certainty about something. Sometimes we need something smaller than an MVP to learn on a key result. So MVPs can definitely be used as a way to make progress towards learning and achieving outcomes. But I'm not sure I will structurally fit that into the OKR framework. I have to think about it a bit more. Yes, Tomo, you have your hand up.
If I had two OKRs and one of them said take the dominant position in the market, another said increase my position in the market, would I do something different? Isn't that the same from the point of view of get to work and do this?
I think you might. I mean, if my market position is 3% and it says increase, 4% is enough. Dominant, I don't know. We probably need to be a bit more specific around what that means, but dominant would not, 4% would not be dominant. We can agree on that. And that probably drives different behavior and different decisions around what should we try to do there. So it's much more specific around where do we want to be.
So I might go out and borrow $2 million and say we need a whole lot of advertising if I want a dominant position.
Yeah, maybe.
And so I should do it because I have an OKR to say it.
I mean,
whereas the other one.
The point is not that we do something because there is an OKR. The point is that discussing OKRs and forming OKRs, especially OKRs that are more specific and well-formed, helps create clarity around what's important for the organization, what's realistic, what are we really trying to achieve here. And in that sense, achieving a dominant position is a smarter, more specific OKR, right? Evidence-based management. Here we'll get to that in a bit. Examples in the chart in more detail. So, for example, fix 10 major critical defects. That could be a key result that is more task-oriented. If we want to make that a bit more outcome-oriented, let's ask, why are we doing that? Well, we are fixing major critical defects in order to improve our customer satisfaction rating. And if we want to be more specific, we want to increase our net promoter score from, I don't know, -20 to 10 or 35 to 60. I imagine if our net promoter score was 35, might not be such a big deal to fix defects. Our quality is probably okay, but if we're in negative net promoter score, it might be a higher priority for us. All right, let's proceed and get back to more questions later on. Thank you for bringing those on. This is the most fun, but let's cover some more ground and see which questions remain. So somebody asked about evidence-based management, which is funny because that's the next slide. So assuming that OKRs, most of them live in the complex domain, what we need to do is think about what's the best way to manage work in the complex domain. And we know that Scrum and Agile is great in managing work in the complex domain, but sometimes we don't have a team. Sometimes it's harder for the organization to map, the work that they're doing on an OKR to a classic, Scrum team developers structure. Maybe they don't want to think this way, and evidence-based management, which is Scrum.org's framework for bringing empiricism to a wider audience in the organization, can be really helpful. Because what it talks about is applying transparency, inspection, and adaptation, and the need to focus on outcomes and not go too specific into the how, to areas beyond just the classic Scrum team. If you look at the framework on the right, basically what we want is to understand that on the way towards a strategic goal, we need to use empiricism, the experiment loop, the development of an hypothesis to experiment and measure, inspect what's going on and adapt through immediate tactical goals, a focus on immediate tactical goals towards intermediate goals that eventually get us closer to our strategic goal. So the advantage here is that this is a somewhat more generic framework that businesses and business leaders can relate to, even if they don't necessarily map, everything in Scrum to their world, to the world of achieving an OKR. EBM can basically be seen as, I wouldn't call it a Trojan horse because it's not, but it could be seen as a way to bring Scrum and Agile thinking into the space of alignment frameworks and and focusing our strategic execution. So it can be very powerful to start to use the language of EBM, evidence-based management, as you're trying to help your organization do OKRs well. It's not necessarily a replacement for OKRs. Some people see it as a replacement for OKRs. The way I typically use it is as a way to improve how we're using OKRs. How are we looking at OKRs? Get the organization to understand that OKRs are a strategic goal for us, or sometimes an intermediate goal, and there's a requirement to use empiricism for how do we make progress, how do we measure progress, how do we make decisions along the way towards achieving these goals. So EBM can be a framework that helps us achieve OKRs. All right, so that brings us to the next issue, which again is a real problem if we assume that OKRs live in the complex domain, or OKRs require complex work in order to achieve them most of the time, because it's developing, business capabilities, technology, different approaches to stuff. It's not just running through the motions of the existing business. If we're working in that space, using the same command and control approach that we were used to before OKRs is going to be too detailed, too strict. It's going to be top down. It will kill autonomy and initiative. It would lead to task output orientation by the time that the team create their key results. They're basically told what to do. They told what to focus on. They don't have the freedom to explore optionality. And this brings us back to MBO. MBO is the precursor to OKRs. And if you look at the difference, MBO focuses on what we want to achieve, slightly higher level. OKRs via the KRs are a bit more specific about what we would like to measure and see. I kind of disagree that this is the how, or it shouldn't be the how. That's one of the anti-patterns. And you can see here how people that talk about OKRs still have some of that MBO thinking. They need our help as Agilists to, shift them in the right direction. MBOs typically have a longer cycle than OKRs because they assume static knowledge. They assume we know what we want to do. They're a bit more private. Each person has their own MBOs. OKRs are a public, transparent management framework. There's transparency around what we're trying to achieve. It's not a person's own objectives. One of the anti-patterns, by the way, is to have individual OKRs. We want to have OKRs for, teams or across functions, not to individuals, because we don't want to encourage individual focus. We want to encourage systems thinking. One important change in OKRs is to mostly divorce it from compensation as compared to MBO. And MBO creates risk aversion. OKRs are designed to be ambitious, driving aggressive, aspirational behavior. But we need to be careful in, making sure that our culture supports that. Just by saying we will have aggressive and aspirational OKRs is not going to work if people are punished every time they don't achieve their OKRs. So we need to have the right culture to help make the transition from MBO to OKRs. It's not just about renaming the pattern. Actually, just renaming things and saying now we have OKRs is what I call OKR theater. Calling things different names, but it's still, the old behavior, and you're not really seeing the results, and you're complaining that this doesn't work for you. OKRs are at least intended to be an alignment framework that leverages autonomy. If we look at Henrik Nieberg's model from the Spotify engineering culture video, OKRs are about this quadrant: high alignment, high autonomy. OKRs are the tool that helps us get from low alignment to high alignment without the pitfall of being too specific. But a lot of organizations, when we go in and look, the way they do OKRs is up in the top left quadrant, which is higher alignment, but we killed some of the autonomy along the way. So the trick here is, how do we achieve alignment without slipping into command and control? There's this sense of cascading, a term called cascading OKRs, which is the way you scale, or some OKR thought leaders talk about how to achieve OKRs at scale across the organization. You come up with the organizational OKR, and then you cascade it throughout the organization. What do we mean by cascading? The fact that I created an OKR at the top company level creates and directs the creation of OKRs elsewhere in the organization. And when we do that, we lose the ability to have autonomy and freedom around how to actually achieve those OKRs. If we look at how mission command works in the army, whether it's Marine Corps, Israeli army, Persian army in the 18th century and beyond, that's not how even the army manages missions. What actually happens is that mission command provides context for what's the bigger mission that we want to achieve, and then each one of the levels below, whether it's the division, the battalion, the company, the squad, does their own mission planning in light of the higher level mission. And that's what we're trying to actually do with OKRs. Ben Lamort wrote a great book called the OKRs Field Book that talks about it a bit. You can see one of the charts on the bottom right. But essentially what we're trying to do here is to set high-level OKRs that inform rather than prescribe OKRs throughout the organization, and then teams or teams of teams define their own OKRs bottom up and sideways. So what is our OKRs, and let's get informed from what OKRs are happening next to us, and let's inform what OKRs groups that we need to collaborate with come up with. It creates some sort of network of informing, aligning across the organization. And one cool trick is to say, okay, we came up with our OKRs, but we want to be clear on how they connect to others in the network, and having a field or a description about why now, why are we doing this OKR now, can help with that. So the OKR for this team on the bottom left here could include why now that talks about some local context and or the bigger context in the organization. One thought here is that we could take inspiration from how we plan sprints in Scrum. We have a sprint goal, but the team is planning what can fit into the sprint, and that informs back the goal. We don't tell the team exactly what to work on in the sprint. So there's this balance between aligning on why are we doing what we're doing and what are the priorities, and letting teams do the planning of what's realistic for them. Aspirational, but realistic, and teams own that. We don't tell teams what to do. We don't cascade direction on what to do. So one of the things that startups face as they're scaling up and trying to use OKRs, either as they're scaling, continue to use OKRs, or use OKRs as part of their approach to scaling. And there's a similar challenge when bigger business units and stable, larger enterprises try to use OKRs, is that when you're trying to achieve big things, impactful things at the organization, there's a lot of collaboration that is needed across the different disciplines and functions, silos in the organization. Going back to overcoming silos, politics, turf wars, this is a real problem for a lot of organizations, including healthy organizations. Just the fact that we are designing and scaling our organization around disciplines and functions creates the need to collaborate across these functions. Why does it matter that we have OKRs that require this collaboration? There's overhead to coordinate across these functions, and it's becoming tempting to divide and conquer, to create OKRs for each one of the groups. And this is probably familiar again to anyone who's worked with Agile teams that were, let's call it, component teams rather than stream-aligned teams or empowered product teams. And this relates back to the comment earlier about what an OKR for a component team might look like. An OKR for a real component team, a lot of the time, would have to be something that is more output or task-oriented rather than a real outcome. An OKR, by the way, for a platform team could be a meaningful outcome, because a platform team sees their platform as a product, and they think of how can we serve the internal market in a way that reduces the amount of dependency on us, enables self-service. You could come up with great OKRs in that context. But complicated subsystem teams, component teams, that's a struggle. So if the organization is tempted to divide and conquer this way, you slip very quickly into ineffective OKRs. So what should we do about it? Well, maybe organize around value. One of the things that I do when I see that in organizations is help the organization rethink their team structure. And one potential way to look at it is to create OKR teams. So create teams or team of teams, or even development value streams around what's most strategic for us. You could create a team around a KPI that we want to move the needle on. And essentially, that's what an OKR is, moving the needle on a KPI, moving the needle quite a bit on a KPI. So we could organize around value by identifying the right product or team topology, leveraging the OKR lens. Once we have what are the priorities, what are OKRs, let's bring that into our team design and see if the work towards the OKRs would require a lot of collaboration, coordination across too many teams. And let's maybe think about how to reorganize in a way that makes more sense. And when we keep OKRs at the outcome level, that unlocks engagement and motivation. People have more purpose when they work towards an outcome-oriented OKR rather than, tasks and milestones. One other issue that we see often is that OKRs come from above. Scrum comes from, the bottom or the middle, and eventually they run into each other. And we see a situation where OKRs run in parallel to Scrum artifacts and commitments, which creates confusion. Like, what do we use for input into sprint planning? Should it be our backlog? Should it be our OKRs? When do we create our OKRs? How do we create OKRs in a way that is realistic, that keeps the team's real ability in mind? What's the relationship between OKRs and the goals we use in Agile and Scrum, product goals, sprint goals? There's a lot of confusion and a lot of optionality here, a lot of potential to actually use OKRs to guide us. So we could use OKRs to guide us when we refine our backlogs. When we want to look at how we're doing during the sprint review, for example, let's talk about our OKRs. Let's continue to inspect and adapt how we're doing towards the OKRs and use that to adapt and prioritize the product backlog. So we should integrate these two worlds rather than try to keep them separate. So for example, in our sprint review, we could take a look beyond what's the increment of working stuff that we've created in our product backlog. We want to also take a look at what's currently going on in the business, for example, via how are we doing on our KPIs, and what are we trying to achieve strategically, and how are we doing towards that? So looking at the picture of where are we towards our immediate tactical goals, our intermediate goals, and the strategic goals, and let's use all of that when we're thinking about what should we do next. So hopefully you can see already that Scrum and Agile principles and practices, complexity, evidence-based management can be really powerful to make sure that we're using OKRs in a healthy, sustainable, effective manner. And I've also seen that by latching onto OKRs can be a carrier mechanism for the Agile practitioner to help bring agility, understanding of agility and the concepts that we believe in more widely across the organization. So if we can make sure that the organization uses OKRs with an eye towards complexity, bringing empiricism to how we create them, leaving room for optionality, empowering teams to figure out what their OKR should be, this can help us have a lot of effective conversations around empiricism, self-management across the organization, even if there's no awareness or desire to use Agile in that space. So if you're interested to think about this some more, this was quick, right? If you want to dive deeper, there are a lot of opportunities, a lot of write-ups, books to keep in mind. We'll share the presentation afterwards, and all of these links would be clickable, so you don't have to worry about typing anything, but just a list of potential resources to take a look at. If you are interested to dive deeper into EBM as a way to improve or fix or start to use OKRs effectively, I have a class coming up on May 1st together with Madison Henry, which will be a remote live virtual classroom that there's a specific nice Austin Agile Austin discount for that Madison Henry provided, and there's also Professional Scrum with Kanban class if you're interested. That's coming up in April. So let's pause here. I'll keep this view up and let's look at the chat for questions. I noticed Sherry C was taking great notes for everybody. Thank you, Sherry. Let's try to look for questions in between those notes. If anybody has a question, feel free to.
I scrolled back a little ways. I think there was a good topic from Tom. Isn't there collaboration between top-down and bottom-up OKRs? I don't know how realistic it is to only have bottom-up OKRs.
Yeah, it's not going to be only bottom-up OKRs. Let me go back to this slide. That's definitely not the intent. We do have a network of OKRs. Like in the Army, there is a mission. There is an overall mission of what are we trying to do. But in light of that mission, the different groups create their own OKRs rather than be told what the OKRs would be. So we have top-level OKRs that inform. Then we have the different groups come up with their OKRs, and we also have a structure around that in which the teams share their OKRs with other groups and leadership, get feedback on it, maybe iterate through it. You can think of it very similar to, this is the Agile scaling SIG, right? So everybody's probably familiar with big room planning or program increment planning, which is a very similar pattern, or is designed to be a very similar pattern. We set the context, we break out, teams do their planning in light of that context. Then we share where we are, what plans we can achieve. We talk about PI objectives. We get feedback, both from business owners, leadership, other teams. We iterate through the breakouts again. We reconvene, get more feedback. It's an interplay of context and decentralized control coming up with the plan. Reinertsen, in one of the best chapters in his book about principles of product development flow, calls this decentralized control with alignment. You can't have decentralized control without alignment. If you look at David Marquette, he talks about clarity and competence. OKRs provide clarity. What are we trying to achieve? It's not about bottom-up anarchy.
So I think Tomo has a question that's on a lot of our minds. What presentation tool are you using that lets you put your image over the slide? It is cool.
The presentation tool is Zoom. So if you go to share screen in Zoom and PowerPoint, if you go to share screen in Zoom and click advanced, there's an option to use PowerPoint live there, and it just takes any sort of PowerPoint and you do this.
Nice. I did not know that. I'll have to play around with that. Thanks for that. So there was a question a little ways back in the chat. What are likely OKRs for a component team?
Yeah. So if we go back to this slide, if we have component teams, what's the definition of a component team? Let's use team topology. So if you look at team topology as a component team, complicated subsystem team, the real distinction of this sort of team is other teams need them to do some stuff in their component as part of building the product, building value, which means that as a team, they struggle to create value directly. And in that environment, I wouldn't even create OKRs for component teams. They would just contribute to the OKR at the product level. OKRs don't need to be at the team level. OKRs can stay at the relevant level in the organization. One OKR for a component team could be, listen, we don't feel it makes sense to be involved in everything. We don't want to be the constraint for the organization. We want to get out of constraint mode. Let's think about how can we create a platform out of this? How can we move from being involved in everything to self-service mode? Can we take the things that people ask from us most of the time and create a platform or an API or teach people how to use? That could be an OKR, which changes the way the component team runs. I hope that helps.
I think so, thanks. And yeah, just a point of order, a question from Rico, where can we get the slides? I'll first say the recording, we'll have it on our YouTube channel, hopefully by the end of the day, but Yuval, for the slides, is that something you could maybe post to the meetup page?
Yeah, definitely. I'll post this both on SlideShare as well as provide a link at the meetup.
Okay, great. So yeah, I'll also post the YouTube, the link to our YouTube channel for the recording when that's available on the meetup page too. So it looks like Tom has his hand raised.
Yes, thank you. Sorry, I turned my camera on, but I'm actually on vacation this week and I haven't showered yet, so I'll just say that in transparency. So one of the questions I had, and maybe just in your experience and observation, I'm finding that this ideal of autonomy and self-directing teams and stuff, that's like you wove that into some of this presentation. I'm finding that like you can't go out of the gate, at least in my experience, you can't go out of the gate and say, okay, I'm going to describe this to you. I'm going to kind of set the target, the desired outcome, and let you figure it out without some hand holding initially. That teams and individuals don't know how to function with that autonomy until I do some level of what I call the Karate Kid's wax on, wax off. Like the kid didn't know why he was doing those actions, but he just kept doing them until he was finally instructed to show how these things actually worked with his karate. What has been your observation?
I think there are multiple planes at which we could apply, this shuri that you're talking about, the wax on, wax off example. If we're talking about the content, what are the actual activities, the work that we need to do to achieve the OKRs? It really depends on what's the maturity of the people that are going to be working towards these OKRs, whether they'll need to be told or whether they actually have the knowledge already and just need the clarity. It's a question of what's the level of competence in the content. And, situational leadership applies. If you have people that need to be guided more closely around the content, fine, do it with the aim to grow them to the point that they can self-manage. When it's the OKRs mechanism that we're talking about, or similarly it applies to Scrum, we do need to handhold people a bit and coach them on why are we doing things this way. But that doesn't mean that we need to have task-based OKRs. That doesn't mean that we need to create an environment where they are told what their OKRs should be. We should just coach them around the process of, okay, now we understand the context. Now we need to go through a very detailed, a concrete process of how do we come up with our own OKRs. They might need coaching there. It's not just, throwing them in the deep end. But that coaching doesn't need to involve telling them how to do their work. It involves telling them how to run the process of coming up with OKRs, not what the OKRs should be. That's where I draw the distinction, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that helps. I think one of the key things that you said was about maturity.
Awesome. Other
Excellent.
questions?
Well, yeah, I think we are at time. So
Yeah.
I wanted to thank Yuval for joining us. So a virtual round of applause for him. And we are looking forward to next month's presentation, which will be coming up and pretty much same time of the month on a Friday. And yeah, so thanks again, everyone. And we will see you then. Take care.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.